Been a joy to be with old friends like Michael. We became great friends when he was our pastor and rector in the years we lived in Oxford. But he didn't know it. But before that, when I was a student at London University, it was listening to some of his Bible studies. They were so inspiring that it prompted me as a layman to tackle Bible studies from time to time and to preach occasionally. But I never heard the scriptures brought to life like the way Michael did. The first study in the 7 churches in Revelation, I haven't forgotten it to this day, nearly 50 years ago. So it's been an enormous joy to be with you all. 2 or 3 of you have asked me what on earth my real name is. My family and some friends know that I never appreciated my parents giving me the name they gave me. My family's Irish, so why they named me after an Anglo-Saxon king whose head was lopped off a long time ago, I've no idea. But I do know that they actually named me after Oswald Chambers, who was a great friend of my grandparents. I never liked the name because at school I was teased infinitely in all sorts of ways for it. When I was lecturing in London once, my wife was next to me. A lady came up and she said, "I'm Oswald Chambers' daughter. I gather you were named after my father. How do you like the name?" I thought, my wife is very candid. There's no BS possible. So I said, "I read your father, I admire your father, I enjoy him immensely, but to be honest, I've never liked the name." She laughed and she said, "He hated it too." So improved a little for me. As I said yesterday, I was brought up in China. And in the part I remember, we lived in Nanjing. It had been brutalized by the rape of Nanking in 1937-38. And when we were living there in the 40s, the looming threat of Mao Zedong's Red Army was coming closer and closer. And while it had been ravaged in various ways in World War II, you could still see the ruined glory of the old Ming capital. Because around 1500, Nanjing was the capital of the most powerful, prosperous country on the earth. No one would have conceived China would have been passed. China had sent a fleet to Africa with ships 4 times the size of Christopher Columbus's. The emperors in Nanjing had sent 1 million men to build the new city that became the Forbidden City in Beijing, and so it goes on. But suddenly, what they considered a little cultural backwater off the western landmass of Asia suddenly rose to dominance and for 500 years dominated Great China. And as China began more recently to recover from the humiliation of the European powers, they raised the question, why did Europe suddenly surpass us? And there was a famous discussion at the Chinese Academy of the Social Sciences. And they said, what was it in Europe that allowed this to happen? The cultural backwater turned us into a backwater. Was it their guns? No, they said. Was it their economy? Partly, but not really, they said. Was it their laws? Partly again, but not really. Was it their politics? No. What was it? And their conclusion, it was in their terms, their religion. In other words, the Christian faith. But then Jewish scholars jumped into the discussion and pointed out rightly, that's right, but not the whole story. Anyone thinking the Christian faith dominated in Europe since the 4th century when it replaced the faith of mighty Rome. But it didn't dominate the world. What was it about the 16th century? And the Jews pointed out rightly, it was not the Christian faith in general, but the Reformation in particular. Now, this is the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, as we all know. But in all that I've heard, you hear some people still confessing the divisions. Wasn't the first division, that's much earlier between the Catholics and the Orthodox, but it was tragic. and yet it was a necessity because of the corruption. Many in the more reformed circles, and evangelicals too, celebrate all the gifts of the Reformation in terms of the heart of the gospel. The recovery of the gospel itself, the restoration of the authority of Scripture, and the recovery of the place of lay people in the church. These things are all true, but historians also say that the Reformation is the single strongest set of ideas that's created the modern world, if sometimes despite the reformers themselves. What was it about the Reformation that put its stamp not only on the church, but on wider society and the culture? And obviously, we're missing today. You can itemize a whole number of things, but for me, the top three are these: conscience. And you think how it was that Roger Williams and Thomas Howells and others recovered the place of religious freedom, because the first references to religious freedom are by Christians, Tertullian. And then a little later, Lactantius. Very significant because he was the tutor to the Emperor Constantine's son, and his ideas are probably reflected in the Edict of Milan. But of course, in those long Catholic centuries, freedom of conscience was forgotten, and it was squelched and oppressed. And it was the Reformation and some of the nonconformist thinkers who recovered freedom of conscience, and it was vital in the whole rise of human rights. Not the Enlightenment, but the Reformation. Or you could look at another C, calling. There's enormous controversy surrounding Max Weber's idea that calling, the spirit of capitalism, was created by the Protestant ethic. Calling. Highly controversial, but there's no question that calling gave rise to the sense of purpose and dynamism and entrepreneurialism and that sense of mission out into the world. So the salt became salty and spread powerfully and so on. Those two are much discussed. But I want to focus on a third one, which is often overlooked, but extremely powerful, and provides a key to understanding the past, and I suggest to you, a key to thinking about so many of the challenges in the church and more widely today. And that is the third C, the great notion of covenant. Historians say that the book of Exodus is the master story of Western freedom through the contribution of Exodus plus the Sinai covenant. And let me set out a number of propositions that help us to get into that and then think of its significance today. First, put this notion of covenantalism into our thinking about politics and government. Most people, when they're talking about politics, think of the Greek classifications. Plato, Aristotle, the big three, you know them well. Monarchy, the rule of one, which when corrupted becomes tyranny. Aristocracy, the rule of the excellent few, which when corrupted becomes oligarchy. And democracy, the rule of the people, which when corrupted becomes mob rule and anarchy. The big three, in an ideal form, each with their corruptions. But as pointed out more recently, those only describe governments. And you'd have a different classification if you look at not governments, but societies and how they are founded and run. And when you look at it this way, there's another three. Many societies were founded and flourish as organic societies. They are linked by blood and kinship, like a Scottish clan, like an African tribe. Obviously, in today's mobility and so on, fewer of those than in the past, but still existent. The main type of founding, by far the most common, is hierarchical, linked by power, linked by force and conquest, such as a kingdom originally, or an empire in any form. the hierarchical one. And the third type, the covenantal. The covenantal, built by a voluntary binding agreement among the people, or later, the citizens. Now, of the third type, the three great examples are the Jews, the Swiss, the Articles of Confederation, going right back to the 13th century, and of course, the United States. But far more important than just saying that, what is distinctive about the Sinai covenant that has become so powerful in history? You know well that there were other covenants. The Hittite suzerainty treaties, Alexander the Great's Corinthian League, the Celtic oath societies. All of these were forms of covenant. And we know too that even in the scriptures themselves there are other covenants. The covenant with humanity under God and Noah. The covenant with Abraham and his family. Why is it that Sinai was so powerful? Well, for a start, unlike many of the other covenants outside the scripture, the Lord is himself a partner. He's not under God or calling on God to hold them accountable like the suzerainty treaties. The Lord himself is a partner. Secondly, unlike many other forms of government, it was the Lord's covenant with everyone. We often talk about Athens as the roots of Western democracy, but the covenant is far earlier and far more powerful and far more comprehensive. In Athens, it was only about 20% of the men who could go into the agora and debate and deliberate and vote. Certainly not the rest of the men, and certainly not the women or the children or the foreigners. But the Sinai covenant is with the men, the women, the children, and amazingly the born and the yet to be born, because it's an intergenerational project that included everybody. And of course, unlike the other treaties of the time, it covered the whole of life. The others were contracts, really, narrow, legally binding, and only in small areas, because you only wanted to be held accountable in small areas. But the covenant, sex and farming and all sorts of things, they're all under the terms of the covenant. But it wasn't those features that put its stamp through the Reformation on wider political society. It was three other features. First, the covenant is a matter of freely chosen consent. The rabbis point out it is not a theocracy, as we're often accused of following. It is a nomocracy. It's the rule of law, but they signed on 3 times, it says in Exodus, all that the Lord says we will do. As the Jews point out, even when the master of the universe proposes something, it only becomes a ratified covenant when the people sign on. That is actually the origin of the consent of the governed. Right back to Sinai, the consent of the governed. Again, the rabbis point out there is no precise Hebrew word for obey, as opposed to, say, Islam, with the very notion of submission. Instead, they point out, the closest is the word which means to listen, and even that doesn't quite cover it, because it's the old English word to hearken, or to pay heed to, or to bring a focused moral attention to, so that someone hears physically, but then deliberates in their mind and chooses to respond accordingly and truly, and that is the listening that becomes obedient, but freedom and responsibility written into the very idea. Secondly, though, the second feature, it was a morally binding pledge. As I said, the other treaties are usually narrowly legal. They're contracts. This is a covenant with a morally binding pledge. You can think very clearly of its impact, say, on marriage. sickness and health, for better or worse, and all the other things it says, till death do us part. Everything. Compare that with what today is the most common American vow, especially in California. You vow to someone, quote, so long as love lasts. And in the day of the expressive revolution in emotions, that is often not very long. A covenant is a morally binding pledge. But the third part is the most distinctive. The sense of reciprocal responsibility of everyone for everyone. In other words, you have long before the Three Musketeers the notion of all for one and one for all. As one rabbi said, there wasn't one covenant, if you take it seriously. There are 600,000 covenants. Another rabbi answered immediately, no, there are actually 600,000 times 600,000. Work that one out in your calculator. In other words, each Jew covenanting to themselves to the Lord and to each other Jew completely. And that's what gives us the rise of loving your neighbor as yourself. But again, as they point out, that is said once. And it's had a profound impact down through history. Whereas loving and caring for the stranger is said more than 35 times. The stranger, in other words, may not be in my image or your image or our image even. But the stranger is still in the Lord's image, God's image. And therefore we care for the stranger. And as they point out, you were strangers in Egypt and so on. That reciprocal responsibility of all for all, which is so powerful in the survival of the Jews and so profoundly important. Now, just stop for a minute and think. Democracy has zero social content. None at all. Whereas covenantal thinking has written into it that relationships are the heart of everything. Of families to families, of people to their neighbors, of everyone to everyone. Relationships and the integrity and quality of relationships are at the very heart of everything for those who live covenantally. Democracy, zero social content. Doesn't matter how you behave. It's just a matter of the people can vote. And even that's a matter of numbers. We needn't go into that. But covenantal societies, quite different. Now move on. If that's true, why did that put a stamp on history? Well, it did, the historians show us, in three particular periods. The first and obvious one is the impact on the Jews. Now you notice they have the covenant centuries before they have a monarchy. In other words, those covenantal relationships in general, are more important than regimes. And you don't tell the nature of a society by its governments, but by its relationships at the ground level. Relationships before regimes. But of course, even when they had a monarchy, it was a mixed blessing. And when they lost it, and they lost the temple, and they lost even their land, and they were persecuted mercilessly and scattered to the four corners of the earth, what was it that kept them together? The covenant. And you can see how Jewish survival, almost miraculously in many ways, was solidified and centered into the fact that all over the world, wherever they were covenantal. Now, here's the point. That's what the Reformation recovered. Now we have to immediately say that the church before, I'm just saying this as a matter of history, was not covenantal. Sad to say, when the church dominated in the 4th century, instead of going to the scriptures for its ways of living together, it imitated, maybe without thinking and certainly uncritically, it imitated, as historians say, too many Greek ideas and too many Roman institutions. And you can see how the church from the 4th century, still today, is hierarchical, based on power, as the Roman Empire was, and the papacy reflected the Caesars, and you go down the line. The point being that when hierarchical types of government are corrupted, based on power, all power tends to corrupt, Who said that? A Catholic layman, Lord Acton. All power tends to corrupt, and absolute power, absolutely. He was talking about the Catholic Church. He was talking about the Catholic Church, and when that power was corrupted, it became oppressive. Now we need to understand today in our own critique of power that the problem of power is not just that it oppresses the weak. That's the obvious problem, and that's tragic and unjust. But the other part of the problem is corrupt power corrupts the powerful. And that's the tragedy of the story of the medieval church. And out of that came the Inquisition, the forced baptism of the Jews, and endless horrors connected with anti-Semitism and other things like that, including the horrendous notion, which you only see today among the new atheists, error has no rights. So when the Reformation came on, it actually reversed that. It went back to Exodus and back to Sinai. Now, if the Catholics took the wrong form of government, we've got to say many evangelicals today have read the Exodus and personalized it and spiritualized it only. So it's nothing to say to anything social or political. It's all about a foretaste of my salvation or our salvation. But the Reformation didn't do that. Calvin taught it much more systematically, picked up even more by Zwingli. And then it went to Scotland under John Knox. And if you read Oliver Cromwell in the English Revolution, he says Exodus, the Sinai, I'm quoting, is the only direct parallel what we're trying to do here. Now, of course, as you know well, it failed in England. Historians call it the lost cause. The king came back. But what was the lost cause in England became the winning cause in New England. And covenantalism is at the heart of the Mayflower Compact. The covenant was what John Winthrop preached on as a Puritan coming from Cambridge, taught by William Perkins and others. That's what he talked about on the Arbella. And you can see covenantalism built into New England churches, built into New England marriages, built into New England townships, and eventually built into their states. And the state of Massachusetts, its constitution is actually the form of a covenant, as John Adams, who drafted it, spells out quite clearly. In other words, what became constitution is actually a secular, somewhat secularized form of covenant. The voluntary binding agreement of we the people in whatever it was, whether two people in a marriage or a township or a state or eventually an entire country like the United States. And it was the Reformation which put that incredible stamp on history through the recovery of covenantalism becoming constitutionalism. By the 18th century, it became not only the US Constitution, but the notion of constitutionalism, and has gone all over the world, but without the roots and without the understanding which made it so strong, which is why today constitutions in many countries fail, and others can be made anything anyone wants to make of them because they lack the biblical grounding that you have in the book of Exodus. Now let me go on one stage further and talk about the strengths and weaknesses of constitutional or covenantal ways of running things. Every system has its pluses and minuses. The Greeks understood that, and they said, looking at monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, that was why, as they put it, the wheel is constantly turning. And you have the element of entropy and corruption coming in, and nothing lasts forever, certainly not freedom. And the same way you can look in the scriptures. Sinai, not too long till Judges. No king in Israel, and everyone doing what was right in their own eyes. And you can see the cycle of renewal and decline and renewal and decline. Bad kings and good kings calling them back, and the prophets always calling them back. But what are the strengths and weaknesses of constitutional or covenantal ways of running things? Well, the great strength has been the bringing together of faith, freedom, and responsibility. The trouble in today's world, faith and freedom just roll off the tongue like cliches. But if you think, free societies rarely ever last. And the greatest enemy of freedom is freedom. To actually have faith that is responsible and free is very, very rare. And historians point out that was the contribution of covenantalism. If you read someone like Tocqueville, who wrote a book on America called Democracy in America, he's a Frenchman coming from Catholic France, and he says, in most of European histories, those who loved religion fought liberty. And those who loved liberty fought religion. The two were at loggerheads. And we've got to be honest, in most of our European history, the relationship of faith and freedom is fraught with conflict. But, Tocqueville says, what startled him as a Frenchman coming to America is the spirit of religion and the spirit of liberty go hand in hand. Now, Edmund Burke, our great Irish statesman, he saw that long before then. In his defense of the American colonies in the House of Commons, he said we shouldn't be surprised at this because these people, he said, are the Protestants of Protestantism. They are the dissenters of dissent. And it was the Reformation which allowed them to bring together their faith and their freedom with responsibility. And that rolls off the tongue saying it, but it's actually extraordinarily rare. And that's the great gift of covenantal ways of doing things. What's the greatest weakness? That's easy to see too. It's based on a freely chosen consent and a morally binding pledge. The trouble is, the Lord keeps his word, we don't. Even Nietzsche says this. Nietzsche says, humans are the animals entitled to make promises. Remarkable passage when he describes this. The trouble is, he says, we make our promises, we don't keep them. If you think promise keeping's at the heart of freedom, I don't mean in great grandiose ways. I'll see you tomorrow. I'll be there if I can be. We're making ourselves debtors to the future by all sorts of promises, small and large, that we're making. And we humans break them all the time. But when we keep them, and what we say we do, then we're predictable to others, and trust is built through promise keeping. But you can see in our societies today, in our Western world, trust has collapsed. Institutions aren't trusted. Parliament's not trusted. Congress is not trusted. The church is not trusted. But personal relationships are broken too. And you can see trust is at a very low ebb in business and in all sorts of areas because we humans simply don't keep promises. Now you have thinkers like Machiavelli. He plays on this and says, why should we keep promises? If you read The Prince, he says whatever the prince said yesterday is irrelevant today. He said that yesterday out of yesterday's interest, and today he may have different interests, so he has no obligation at all to keep his word. Promise keeping is for the birds, essentially. David Hume, the great Scottish philosopher and skeptic, he pooh-poohed it too in strong ways. John Locke, very interesting, he's often criticized because he allowed freedom of conscience for Protestants, of course. For Catholics, somewhat more grudgingly in the 17th century, but he didn't allow it for atheists. And people today say, well, John Locke was very tolerant, but that was maybe a bridge too far because he still had residual prejudices against atheists. That wasn't his thinking. His point was that covenants and things like this depended on accountability. I will do this, so help me God. But the atheists didn't believe in God, so there was no accountability, so their words couldn't be taken seriously. Why should they be granted freedom of conscience when there was no standard of accountability by which they could be held, and so on? But you can see the wrestling in his heart over this issue. The Lord keeps his word, we don't. That's the great weakness. The third part is, what is the great requirement of covenant? In one simple word, it's transmission. It has to be handed on from generation to generation. The born, yes, the yet unborn, too, if it's handed on to them well. But that's the tough one. Again, as the rabbis point out, if you read the rabbis too, what did Moses say on the night of the Exodus, the Passover? Hundreds of years of slavery. Did he talk about freedom? No. They're leaving the land of captivity for the promised land flowing with milk and honey. Did he talk about the promised land? No. Did he talk about the risks of going through the howling wilderness? No. What did he talk about? Children. Children. And as the Jews say, societies that want to be free, the school matters much more than the army. And that's why it's tragic that, say, the Reformation catechism, as Jim Packer and many others have pointed out, has virtually collapsed in the modern church. And the crisis of generationalism, which we have in the culture for different reasons, I could have said that yesterday, the crisis of generationalism is now in the church. But isn't that faithful handing on from generation to generation? Freedom and faith don't last because they require transmission. Now this brings us through to part of our crisis today. World War II was fought by Churchill in the name of freedom. The West glories in its freedom. As I said, Exodus, by historians, is described as the master story of Western freedom. But of course, it's not the whole story. Friedrich Nietzsche described Exodus and Sinai as a slave revolt in morality. It encouraged the herd to overcome the heroes. And we needed to go back for the hero and the Superman to overcome the herd that was so vile. Now, if you see what Nietzsche's saying, we realize that while the English Revolution, for better or worse, although it was a lost cause, was founded on covenantalism, and the American Revolution, with its success, was founded on it too, the French Revolution was not. And the Russian Revolution was not. And the Chinese Revolution was not. In other words, we have a very mixed picture. I mentioned the Catholic centuries. You can take the fact that those centuries are the single major factor in creating our European secularity. We are the most secular continent in all history. But go back to just before the Revolution. Diderot, the encyclopedist, his great saying, which was picked up by the Jacobin radical in the streets, "We will never be free until the last king is strangled with the guts of the last priest." A little brutal and gory, but you get the idea. Church and state, throne and altar, in total collusion, all-powerful and totally oppressive. And so the revolution threw off what? Both the church and the state, and produced what they call laïcité, the strictest European separation of church and state. And that anti-religious animosity trails down through everything that flows from the French Revolution. If you read, say, the sexual revolution today, as I said yesterday, its primal animosity is against the church. And they say again and again, the sexual revolution will never be complete until the church is vanquished. And why our leading clergy don't understand the place they represent in the targets of the sexual revolution, I don't know. I just think they probably don't read some of these people well. That's the Catholic contribution. We look at Britain, you have a much typically mixed situation. Covenantalism, lost cause in England. It continued somewhat. People know that the tradition of the liberal Whigs in England, that word comes from the Scottish Whigamore, which originally was a word for covenant. And the idea flowed down into certain liberal traditions in England, but is virtually lost today. Even in America, it was once a constitution not with God, as the Sinai covenant was for the Jews, but it was a constitution under God. Today, it's a constitution without God, and without God, it's simply falling apart. And you can see America today is more bitterly divided, politically, racially, economically, culturally, religiously, than at any time since just before the Civil War. And some of the reasons are incredibly obvious. They have lost the roots they had, and America's increasingly a cut flower civilization. Tragically, even the church, though, lacks this notion of covenant in any tough-minded way. And you can see that our marriages are often little better than the marriages outside in society. But you can go back to the Marquis de Sade or Wilhelm Reich, and they openly opposed their views, say, of sex with covenantal views. Many people quote the famous line of Keith Richard, "What is masturbation? Making love to your best friend." That was actually virtually a quote from the Marquis de Sade. What was his point? The triumph of the subject means that it's all about me, or whoever is talking. And so even the other person in the sexual intercourse is merely there for the subject, an object for the subject. Whereas covenantally, love of the neighbor for oneself, as like oneself. The neighbor, with all his or her hopes and dreams and bodies and frailties and all these things, is to be loved the same way I'm loved and never used like that. And you can see so clearly the contrast between covenantal relationships and love and the hookup and what's now technically known as cheap sex. And yet, where's the church on many of these things? Good part of its leadership and many of ordinary people are far closer to the sexual revolution than to our covenantal understanding. Now, put it that way, I would argue, if we had longer, that many of our modern issues are coming down between two very different revolutions. The covenantal revolution is based on Scripture. The French Revolution is rooted in the Enlightenment and thinkers like Rousseau and Diderot. The anthropology, the view of humanity of the biblical revolution is realistic. You have the notion of the capacity for the abuse of power and therefore the separation of powers. Where did that come from? Not Montesquieu. The separation of powers is in the Old Testament, what the Jews call the three crowns, the monarchy, the priesthood, and the prophets. Each of them could be corrupted, and the prophet above all was the social critic, holding the others accountable to what? To the covenant. Read Jeremiah, read Isaiah, read the other. And of course, even the prophets could be corrupted and become false prophets and had to resist them, and so on. Separation of powers because of the capacity for the abuse of power. Very realistic. Read Rousseau. Man is born free, but everywhere's in chains. So remove the odd chain and we'll be wonderful. What they used to call perfectible. You read Wilhelm Reich. Just remove the sexual repressions, whatever you find them, and we'll all be fulfilled and happy and free and peaceful. What utter nonsense. You can see that the covenantal revolution is based on a view of change that starts with the heart and works out and is inevitably slow, but always has to appeal to responsibility, the freely chosen consent. Whereas the Revolution of 1789 and its heirs depends on a radical state-imposed solution. And even Rousseau talks about forcing people to be free, which again is in the sexual revolution. We who are the Christian retards will be forced to be free by various things, including law and regulations and so on. You can see if you move down the line, we're talking about two fundamentally different revolutions and two fundamentally different views of freedom. And finally, the last great difference is in the biblical understanding of revolution and change. It's an accountability under God and to his word. And as Lord Acton points out well, all the other revolutions have no accountability at all. It may be the party, it may be the elite, but finally there is no accountability higher than those in power. And that's why they corrupt themselves and eventually destroy themselves. Part of our modern struggle is a very fundamental struggle for freedom. Tragically, the church is often joining the wrong side. We know that only in Jesus, only in the biblical understanding of humanity and salvation is there genuine, lasting freedom. But of course, the challenge comes back to us. And as the great thinker who put covenantalism back on the map 50 years ago, Daniel Elazar, a Jewish scholar, as he pointed out, covenants came out of the Middle Eastern culture, which was a culture of oases. As many of you have been to the Middle East or North Africa or ever know, oases are magnificent in the desert. But they're never bigger, healthier, or more luxuriant than what? The wellspring at the heart of the oasis. And that, of course, is true of us in the church. Our churches will never be livelier and more refreshing and more powerful than when the wellspring that is the power of the gospel and the power of the Holy Spirit is vibrant in our communities and expanding all the flourishing that God brings to his earth through his good news in Jesus. I hope that made some sense to you. I thank God for the glory of the Reformation in 100 areas with its blind spots. But one of the areas that needs to be picked up and is often forgotten is this notion of how covenant became constitution and in the process restored the place of faith and a lasting freedom. And we, followers of Jesus, are privileged and responsible to be the defenders of that freedom and the champions of that freedom in a world of evil and suffering and injustice and oppression. We have the key. By God's grace, let's stand for it.